As the old Chinook helicopter flew through the night along a course heading back to Base Shank, 31-year-old Staff Sergeant Patrick "Pat" Hamburger, the chopper's flight engineer and gunner, sat strapped in his position at the back of the aircraft. A well-liked soldier with closely cropped hair and an infectious smile. As flight engineer, Pat was the senior enlisted member of the crew, or the crew chief in military helicopter vernacular. This made him the most important crew member behind the pilot and co-pilot. Pat, a National Guardsman from Nebraska, was in charge of all logistical aspects of the helicopter's operations, including loading and offloading cargo and loading and offloading passengers, and was in charge of loading and unloading the Ranger team that had just deployed. From that standpoint, the most important of his tasks for this mission was over once that last Ranger stepped out the back of the helicopter. But loading and unloading cargo and personnel wasn't Hamburger's only duty aboard Extortion 17. He also served as the gunner, putting him in charge of firing any of the 3 M240 lightweight machine guns aboard the aircraft. The M240's effectiveness was limited to close range against enemy ground forces firing light weapons. For the 240s to work, the Chinook would need to be in a hover position just above the ground, not much above treetop level, firing at enemy ground troops with rifles. But against incoming rockets, anti-aircraft fire, surface-to-air missiles, or rocket-propelled grenades, the machine guns were as effective as a pea shooter in a gunfight at the OK Corral, a reality of which Pat Hamburger was all too aware. Hamburger had practiced-fired the weapons many times, but he had never fired the weapons in combat. Like his friend Brian Nichols in the cockpit, this marked his first combat deployment to Afghanistan, his first foray into a war zone. 4 of the 5 members of this Air National Guard flight crew were green from lack of experience. The 2 young Air Guardsmen sitting with Hamburger in the cavernous cargo bay, 24-year-old Corporal Alexander Bennett of Tacoma, Washington, and 21-year-old Specialist Spencer C. Duncan of Olathe, Kansas, were also green when it came to combat. Only the co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer David Carter of Denver, who sat in the cockpit alongside Brian Nichols to help guide him on this first combat mission, had any type of substantial flight experience. Thankfully, the Army had the good sense to draft an initial flight plan for this young crew to keep this bird away from known enemy anti-aircraft positions. The initial flight plan would keep the Chinook away from the Tangi River Valley where the Rangers were headed by foot, which had been the site of 3 attacks on American helicopters within the last 90 days. U.S. military intelligence reported that in the last 3 months, the Taliban had deployed over 100 fighters armed with rocket-propelled grenades solely for the purpose of shooting down a U.S. helicopter. Sending a Chinook over that valley, at least tonight, would be the equivalent of serving a sitting duck up at a point-blank target in front of a double-barrel 12-gauge for target practice with lottery proceeds rewarded to the winner for the kill. Thus, the initial flight plan when deploying the Rangers kept them from flying over that valley. In contrast to the later flight involving U.S. Navy SEALs, the choppers would initially take the Rangers to a relatively safe zone, which had been pre-cleared of enemy insurgents. As will be seen, the second flight plan, involving members of SEAL Team 6, would prove to be irresponsibly dangerous, and indeed foolish given the level of training of the National Guard flight crew, the antiquated equipment, and poor rules of engagement that were guaranteed to get all the Americans killed. If the Taliban knew or even suspected that the Chinook was transporting special forces, their helicopter would become a significant target. At 96 feet in length, the Chinook, an older Vietnam-era helicopter pawned off to the National Guard, had a maximum capacity of 33 in the cargo bay. But on the way back to Base Shank, under the dimmed cabin lights and the sonorous roar of the chopper's twin engines and the thwack-thwack-thwack of the 60-foot rotary blades slicing the night air, Hamburger and his young subordinates sat alone in the cavernous cargo bay, perhaps alone in their thoughts, perhaps wondering what would come next. The guardsmen knew what they were getting into when they enlisted. America was at war. Her opponent in this war on terror